Hello, and welcome back to the Gotti Video Podcast. This is a space where we host conversations with different designers, architects, and industry thought leaders to help educate you in your work. My name is Joe Gotti, and I'm the COO and Director of Design here at Gotti Furniture. On today's episode, we have the opportunity to talk to Michelle Graham, project architect at DLR Group, a firm committed to elevating human experience through design. Michelle holds a Master's of Architecture from Tulane University and is a licensed architect and designer with a focus on justice facilities, including corrections and courthouses, which will be our focus today. Michelle, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. I really appreciate the time. And usually where we start off is I like to just get a little background on you, how you kind of got into architecture, how you found your lane into the justice world.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say the justice world I came into a little bit by accident, but I'll get there, I guess, in a second. But kind of backing up a little bit further, design has kind of always been a part of things that I was interested in. When I was younger, I was always doodling and drawing floor plans or pictures. I remember there was a art class project in middle school, and we had to draw 1-point perspectives to design your dream bedroom. And I had all these crazy design ideas. I was really into rock climbing, and so I had a rock climbing wall to get to the bed that was hung from the ceiling. And and now I'm like, wow, that was really dumb. Who wants to rock climb to bed? But
You'd be surprised.
To each their own.
My son has a slide out of his bed, so.
Hey, that's way cooler. Slide out of bed. But yeah, so eventually I decided I wanted to go to architecture school. As you mentioned, went to Tulane. I got my bachelor's and my master's degree there. I love New Orleans. It's a beautiful city, and
oh yeah,
what's wonderful about Tulane and their program was they're kind of focused on community engagement and kind of making social change through architecture.
Oh wow.
And after Tulane, I moved back to New York, where I'm originally from, and I was working at a very small firm doing primarily like apartment renos, multifamily work, and it was my first job. I needed a job, and it treated me well, but eventually I sort of felt a drive to move back into that more social space, community architecture space. And, I was looking at a bunch of different options. I was also interested in maybe K through 12 or higher ed. Every architect is interested in schools, or in a lot of architects are interested in schools. But I saw a job posting at Ritchie Green Associates, and they were a firm that specialized in justice facilities.
Okay.
I applied and got the job, and I was there for 7 years. I think that's, what drove me into Ritchie Green was, the scale of the projects are very compelling. Courthouses are large. There's multiple different types of users. Very complex in terms of program and design. And I think all those things kind of drove me into that sector as a whole. But what kind of made me stay was this kind of urgent need for, justice reform in the country. And how can we as architects use architecture to help aid in the betterment of the justice system so that those who are touched by it have equal access and equity and all the sort of buzzwords that you hear about today. So I kind of continued through my career. Last year, well, I guess almost 2 years ago now, I made the move over to DLR Group, where they have a very large justice and civic sector. And that's where I am now. And, one of the biggest reasons I moved over there was the sector has a very strong ethos that, focuses on that equity and focuses on, bringing justice to the community communities that we build in.
Mhm. Interesting. So I guess in your kind of experience, it seems like, I can sense the passion for the justice side, and it makes sense. How has things shifted, especially like, there's been a lot of change in the world and in the environment post 2020. How do you think things have shifted, especially on the kind of the criminal justice side in courthouse needs? Like, how does that come through in the architecture, the demands of the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways that things have changed, especially in the safety of both the users of the building who are working in the building and
Mm-hmm.
people who are coming, the public who are coming to the facilities. You know, and I think where what we find critical in this work is finding a way to create that safety while still upholding the kind of civic nature and public nature of the facilities that we're designing and we're building. The when you walk into a courthouse, you still have to go through a TSA level security, but how to
Mm-hmm.
make that security not become a place of trauma for somebody who's coming through the doors and
Mm-hmm.
has, lost custody of their child and is going through a difficult case and or has been a victim of abuse and is now being looked upon by some security officer
Yeah.
trying to go through their bag. And so creating that sense of safety and security within the facilities while still providing the actual physical security that might be required.
Yeah. Is there a project that maybe sticks out in your mind where that like you feel like that was done very well from the like kind of safety perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. A new courthouse that we've recently been working on, the Clackamas County Courthouse
Mm.
in outside of Portland, Oregon, south of Portland. Uses these very large, expansive double height spaces in the entry in order to
Mm.
create that sense of kind of grandeur and civic presence. It also is kind of centered on a civic campus. Um,
Oh, interesting. Okay.
but then the kind of application of materials and the flow as you enter through the facility is a little is beautiful and very quiet. The first thing that you see isn't the x-ray machine and the baggage x-ray. It's
Hmm.
again the expansive double height space and the light flowing
Mm.
through. We also in that facility looked to find multiple ways of access through the building. So there's
Hmm.
a large kind of grand staircase that
Yeah.
gets you up into the first few floors of the building, as well as obviously the elevators to get you to the higher
Hmm.
floors. But providing multiple ways of circulating and wayfinding through the building are sort of some of the successes that I think we see in a lot of our new buildings.
Interesting. So you that lobby space you're saying is that kind of that first engagement point, trying to set that tone of that kind of creating that maybe feeling of grandeur, but also comfort. Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, interesting. How would you say like safety, how does that translate into the courtroom specifically? So, I mean, obviously there's a large part of the building everybody enters, but then you have the smaller spaces. How does that filter into there?
Yeah. In the courtrooms themselves, if you think about a standard courtroom, the judge is at the front and
Hmm.
there's elevated at their bench, there's the spectators. And then if there's a jury, there's the jury box.
Hmm.
The jurors are, within the courtroom themselves, we all often look at ways of creating physical separation while still having the courtroom be open.
Mm.
So in an instance of parties that are hostile towards one another, you want to offer enough physical separation between the
Hmm.
parties so that they feel comfortable when they're in the space. A lot of that comes down to furniture and the way that
Hmm.
those tables in the well in the center of the courtroom are arranged,
Hmm.
and different kind of typical arrangements or atypical, depending on the appetite of the client for sensitivity to allow for that separation. Sometimes we'll see tables put in an L shape so that the everybody is facing each other in an instance where perhaps there's a more collaborative way to move through the court process. Other instances, all the tables are facing forward and everyone is facing forward, and you are facing the judge, and that's kind of the more traditional
Yeah.
you would see. And then sometimes in places like family court, again, when you're looking at smaller cases, more private cases, we've started to make use of curved tables, like half moon
Oh,
tables,
wow.
so that again, it's creating a sense of safety and community, that everyone's in this together to come to the best solution for whatever the case may be.
Interesting. So yeah, I was going to ask you, like, as you go to like different types of courtrooms, like how does that change the dynamic in the interior? We worked on another courthouse project out in Portland, and it was interesting where I went out on site for a furniture kind of sample demo. So we had three different types of furniture, and like the group was all leaning towards like, hey, we should have adjustable height tables. Like it's more equitable for people. What if someone comes in with a very large, maybe motorized, complicated wheelchair, they need to raise it up. It was like, this is great, this is great, this is great. The judge came in, she's like, no way. I would want to mediate between lawyers saying, well, their desk is higher than mine and this and that. And then she's like, well, it could be a perceived thing from the jury, So she kind of brought this other perspective, but then she talked about family court. She's like, no, when I have family court, I want to sit around the table. So they had a requirement where they wanted to have it like so much setback so she could sit there and have the parties around. So it was a dynamic that, we were dealing kind of what you're saying, the separation of space, but then she brought this whole other layer in.
Yeah.
When you're working on projects, is it common that you're working with maybe like a judge or something like that throughout the process?
Yeah, absolutely. We often do have a lot of touch points and user engagement throughout the process, both with judges, with the clerks, with any security staff that's in the building, in order to create a space that we know is going to be functional for the users that are using. I think something that I've found interesting in this whole process since joining kind of the justice sector is that no two courtrooms end up being the same, even though outside they may look the same. Or I guess look the same from, the general sense.
Yeah.
But it's the nuances of the way that the court operates that shifts how the courtroom might lay out and might be formatted.
Interesting. So going back to what you were saying about space too, and just creating space for like for safety and that separation, is there a rule that you are kind of, or a guideline that you're trying to use where, hey, I want to keep like X number of space? Like we talk about this like from like a library and airport furniture perspective, like, hey, if you have at least 12 inches, like we know people will sit next to each other. Obviously, there's a whole different kind of level of feeling of safe and secure. Is there a rule that you guys are trying to like plan for to like, hey, if I know that this party and this party, if they're this far away, that'll kind of build that safety feeling in there?
I don't know if there's a hard and fast rule. It's, a lot. So a tool that we use during the design process is a full scale courtroom mock-up. So usually during kind of the design development phase, in the middle of the project drawing phase, we'll take the time to do a full scale mock-up of the courtroom that we've designed. And it's I'll say fast and loose.
Yeah.
Quick and dirty construction. We're talking, plywood or foam. But what is so illuminating about those mock-ups is how an inch can make a difference in ways than you really think. So for example, oftentimes the judge has their witness sitting directly to one side or the other of them. And the relationship between the height of the judge bench and the height of the witness becomes very important because the judge is somewhat looking down on that person. But you don't want them looking so far down that it's intimidating for the witness. That
Mm-hmm.
you also want it to be balanced so that the judge can get a full picture. If they're too high and the angle is too great, you might only see up to here, to their chin, but
Yeah.
you really want to see more like a bust of the full
Hmm.
height of the person. Similarly, kind of in the well, kind of what you're alluding to with some of the arrangements of tables, you know, perhaps pushing two tables 2 inches apart from one another provides that sense of safety between two different parties that are at the two tables. And those are the kinds of kind of physical things that you feel when you're in those mock-ups. So that's kind
Hmm.
of an important design tool that we use relatively often in our design process.
That's really interesting, that mock-up piece. And that I love that. Like I feel like people don't do that enough. So it's actually very interesting to hear you say that, because it's something like we highly encourage. I mean, we're furniture people, we're product development people. So it's like, it's all about idea, iterate in the physical form.
Yeah.
So when you're doing that, are you creating that mock-up like on site with the client, or is that somewhere else? Or like, how does that, I guess, talk me through that process. The mock-up's built, where does that take place? How are you reviewing that with people and stakeholders?
Yeah, it definitely depends. A lot of times, if it's a renovation on an existing facility, we might, after the demolition, or do an early demolition and do it on site. Most of the time, it's in a warehouse that they find somewhere.
Hmm.
They rent the space for a period of time to have the mock-up built, reviewed, um, sometimes modified. A lot of times it'll be a 2-day process. So we'll go have the discussions, and the mock-up will be designed in a way that it can be quickly modified. So
Hmm.
for example, when we were just speaking about the height of the judge bench, and the height of kind of the top of the judge bench, could be built out of 1 inch boards, so that you could take off a top board and now it's an
Hmm.
inch lower. And so you get that
Hmm.
frame of reference very quickly of this is what it's like if you drop it. As I was saying, sort of start to go, if you have a 2-day mock-up, you can go through that iteration and actually have the time to review, modify, and then review again to confirm that the findings and the adjustments that you're making are correct.
Hmm.
I think a lot of also has come into play with the integration of technology into the millwork and into the
Mm.
that's in the spaces becomes
Hmm.
very important, especially in this day and age,
Yeah.
to ensure that all that technology has space, that you have space for the number of monitors that you require, that the desk is the correct height to view the monitors, that oftentimes there's a printer. Where does the printer need to be
Hmm.
located so that the people using it have quick reachable access?
Hmm.
Um, so the mock-up just becomes kind of critical to nail down those kind of nitty-gritty details before you're actually going into construction.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Again, like I said, it's exciting to hear you guys do that. Like, that's got to be immensely beneficial. So then you kind of build that mock-up. Are you reviewing with like all like the key stakeholders, like a judge, a facilities, a security, a person, kind of
Oh,
going through that with them?
So typically we like to try and have everyone in the room at the same time, because
Hmm.
um, a lot of times the desires of one user might be contradictory to the desires of another user.
Sure.
So it's important to come to consensus during
Hmm.
process of the mock-up. So, I'll be honest, most of the time it's a discrepancy between a need for security and a need for access, or
Yeah.
something that becomes kind of the sticking points. And so being able
Yeah.
to troubleshoot and have everybody in the room together allows you to
Hmm.
through different design solutions and come to the best option that meets the needs of, everybody in the room.
Let me ask you, so it's probably maybe outside of your wheelhouse a bit, like who's monitoring this conversation? Because I think you hit on a really good point, going back to like what I was saying before. It's like, well, it's like, hey, the whole process at the other Portland courthouse was first started off as like access is like from an ADA perspective, like how do we make this accessible? But then like the reality of like, okay, the judicial part came in and it's like, yeah, I get that, but what would be a greater challenge is now in perceived, kind of differences, between parties. And like, that's a bigger issue. Like who's like monitoring or facilitating those questions and trying to mediate / navigate that?
Yeah. I think what you're asking is kind of a larger question almost about the difference between accessibility and what kind of equity or barrier-free design.
Yeah, that was the next question I was going to ask too. Is like, how do you try to find the balance? It's like one, it's like who's helping guide that
Yeah.
questioning, and then
I
kind of
mean,
guide the ship forward to some degree.
yeah, absolutely. It's definitely always part of the conversation.
Yeah,
The minimum is always accessibility, correct?
yeah,
Have to follow certain
yes,
standards in order to meet accessibility requirements. But I think, again, as we are kind of in this reckoning of justice
yeah,
in our society, it's important to think beyond just accessibility and think about um, equity within the courtroom. And a
mm-hmm.
lot you just mentioned about perceived height difference of a table could sway a juror
Yeah,
into thinking that they're more important, so maybe they're more right. And being very mindful of those
mm-hmm.
very small details becomes critical when you're thinking
Yeah,
about room design. And then kind of circling even further back to the public who are walking through the front door.
mm-hmm.
How do you make it the same for every single person that's walking through the door, regardless of their race, their gender, whether they're coming with
Mm-hmm.
kids or no kids, or whether they're coming in the door after having, just lost a family member.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you address, how do design to all those different variables? And I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that we have an answer per se, but it's
Yeah,
definitely things that we're thinking about constantly during the design process. And depending on uh, the jurisdiction and the judge,
mm-hmm.
the users that we're working with, they often have insights into the types of people that they see most often, and we can help design to those needs.
Yeah. And I think that's where, like kind of how you said earlier, where it's like no two courtrooms are kind of the same or two courthouses are the same. And I think that's the challenge that maybe a lot of people don't realize. Like it's a building, it's a judicial building, but all these questions are behind. And as you choose to maybe go in slightly different directions, starts to make each one that kind of unique, because, some people are going to weigh other things more, one thing higher than the other. And it's got to be challenging, and it's a lot to navigate through in there. I wanted to kind of just continue down this path a little bit, but obviously we're a furniture company, so we're passionate about furniture here. And you've kind of touched on this a little bit when we've talked about creating that feeling of safety. I mean, how else do you think like furniture plays a role in like the space, maybe in the courtroom specifically, or throughout the courthouse in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, furniture is obviously very important. Everybody needs a place to sit at the end of the day, or everybody needs a desk. I think in from the moment you walk in the door to any building, but in a courthouse in particular, depending on the scale of the courthouse,
Mm-hmm.
wayfinding is incredibly important. It's akin to walking into an airport. You walk in and you're saying, where do I go? What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And often we use furniture as a tool to help aid that navigation.
Mm-hmm.
You can use different colors for different floors or different areas of the building. Or you can transition the style of furniture from one area of the building to another in order to indicate, a different function of the facility. So definitely one way that we use furniture
Hmm.
in courthouses. Another one that I think is very important is in the kind of lobby waiting areas outside of the courtrooms specifically. Again, linking back to the separation of parties, we can use furniture to create that separation either with physical barriers. A lot of times we've started to introduce levels of screening with like wood slats or
Hmm.
semi-transparent screening
Hmm.
to create that separation while still having visual access for the security officers of the facility to be able to see everything that's going on.
Hmm.
We also use a lot of furniture that is oriented, so it will only face a certain way, and we can face them away from each other so
Hmm.
that again, that separation of parties happens even though they might be in the same space at the same time.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. I guess so. Continuing on that lane with furniture, and then talking about like how that ties into aesthetics of the space. I mean, it feels like when you walk into a courthouse, it always has that kind of judicial presence there. Like, how does that, like, how are you considering that when it comes to aesthetics? I mean, I've know, as we've been doing more and more courthouses over the last 7, 8 years, it's still, I find ourselves like still in a lane of like, sometimes you get more of like the more modern or called transitional. Are you seeing more of that come up, or is it still staying in the lane of like, you know, heavy, like really super heavy wood, traditional, like, style and rail kind of, aesthetics in there? Are you seeing that kind of, or is it still like 50-50?
I'm just thinking about the current projects that I'm working on. And I would say right now it's probably 50-50, but
Okay.
yeah, the aesthetic is often based off of kind of the desires of the client and what their interest and appetite.
Okay.
Either they're more interested in something more transitional or traditional
Mm-hmm.
or something more contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it ends up, in my experience, happening based off of discussions that we have with the users.
Mm-hmm.
The beginning of the project is when we sort of establish what that baseline is, whether we want to lean one way or the other. But kind of thinking more broadly about courthouses, because you're sort of alluding, a lot of people when you say, oh, you design courthouses, they think big marble columns and dark wood and very
Mm-hmm.
traditional.
Yeah.
But a lot, what they're reacting to most often is kind of the civic presence that's
Mm-hmm.
created by putting those materials together in that way.
Yeah.
Uh, and historically, the courthouse was at the center of this square,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a very traditional, gridded town or city. It was often
Mm-hmm.
tallest building. There may have been, a clock tower or something
Mm-hmm.
presence in the town as the center for justice in that town. And so those sorts of ideas about civic presence are what we look to draw from in
Mm-hmm.
contemporary or modern interpretation of the courthouse. So how do you draw from the idea of columns and create
Mm-hmm.
a facade that um, has that civic presence
Yeah.
and has that kind of stance in the town or in the square, wherever the site is, to market as the center for justice.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, because and talking about aesthetics too, it's like I've noticed over the last 5, 6 years where, maybe like 10, 15 years ago, we were doing courthouses. It was much darker tones too. I mean, there's always been the presence of wood. Everything's like heavy wood, heavy wood. And I think there's something about the wood that gives that, judicial feel to it. But I've noticed like in the last 5 years, and it's probably an outside influence of, current more modern trends, but I've noticed like the courtrooms of like the interiors have gotten a lot lighter in tone. Would you say that's like going back to what you're saying earlier, why you kind of went to Tulane, the justice reform? Is you think is that driving that, or is that just like purely like, hey, there's these outside influences going on and like the design world that's feeding into it?
I think some of it is regional. Several of the courthouses I've recently been on project design for have used dark tone wood.
Okay.
But I do think it is trending a little bit lighter in terms of the tone. I think a lot of that, as you said, kind of has to do with the idea of brightening up the
Mm.
courtroom themselves, making them feel more welcoming and less oppressive or
Yeah.
and you laugh, but historically
Yeah. No.
feeling of a judge is that they're laying down the law and they're telling you what's what. And
Yeah.
while that may still be their ultimate job is to provide a judgment on case,
Hmm.
the kind of overall feeling of the court does not need to have that sort of us and them mentality that might have
Yeah.
existed in the past. I
Hmm.
the lightning also has to do with a really big draw to try and bring natural light into spaces. We all know how
Mm.
important natural light is to people's circadian rhythms and
Yes.
general well-being and feeling of comfort in a space. Having the
Hmm.
to see to the outside, whether it's directly through a window or through a clear story that's then looking out to the beyond, gives a
Hmm.
sense there's something else beyond where you are at,
Hmm.
which can often provide a sense of comfort for people who maybe have experienced trauma.
So, kind of in that line, I mean, I think it's interesting saying we're kind of talking about light and how that plays a role, and definitely like it that makes a lot of sense, especially like in the engagement of the environment. So I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit, as I usually like to do at the end as we get kind of towards the end here. What would be like your favorite project or one that really sticks out in your mind that kind of a lot of the points we talked about, talking about like space, creating safety, like we just talked about light, like how, like what would be one that's like a really good example of a lot of these elements here that you can think of and share with us?
Well, from my previous job, the very first courthouse I ever worked on was the Multnomah County Courthouse in Portland, Oregon, downtown Portland.
Okay.
And I was on the design team for the design of the court floors, the courtrooms, and the
Hmm.
public corridors. And I painstakingly detailed every wood slat in that hallway and in those courtrooms so that they perfectly lined up across around the courtroom.
Mm.
The overlay of the module was like a 2-inch module or something. But I think to answer your question, I think that was a really successful building in terms of
Mm.
bringing natural light. We did a lot of studies on the clear story and how to bring light into the courtrooms
Hmm.
through clear story glazing. And even on a cloudy day,
Hmm.
the courtrooms are still relatively bright. They don't have to turn the lights on as high. So they're in turn now using less electricity and less energy
Hmm.
to use the building. And overall, I think there was a lot of successes in that project.
Hmm.
Kind of linking back to some of the furniture that was used in the facility. We did work with you guys, or
Hmm. Yeah.
I shouldn't say we, the team did. I didn't work with you guys directly, but um, you know, we selected furniture in the spaces that in the courtrooms themselves that was flexible so that they could relocate
Hmm.
the tables to meet the needs of different court cases. As I said earlier, sometimes they might face forward, sometimes they might face each other, sometimes they may remove a table or two because they don't need as many, sometimes they may add a table or two because
Hmm.
more. So adding that level of flexibility I think is really important. So that's definitely one that um, I think was a very positive design and had a good impact on the community that it was placed in.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. And, I remember working on that with you guys. That's where we went out for that sample demo with the judge. Also made this comment too, because we have the pictures on our website. It is one of the nicest, I don't know what, I'm blanking on the name of the area, but where the jurors wait before they're selected. Like, that is like one of the nicest areas that I've ever seen for
Yeah.
jurors to wait
Very
before.
down through. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, that whole project turned out really, really, really great. Before I let you go, I'm going to put you on the spot again. Is there any kind of words of wisdom that you want to share with the audience today?
I think I think I'll say be curious
Mm-hmm.
and be engaged. Be engaged in your community, be engaged in what's going on in the world around you. Especially as designers, I think being curious is critical.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm always asking why something is the way that it is, and if if I and if there's a way that we can make it better. There's
Mm-hmm.
almost everything in the world is designed in some way or another, and I think architects in particular have a unique capacity to affect change,
Mm-hmm.
create beautiful space in the process.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. That's great. Well, Michelle, I really want to thank you for your time today. This was awesome.
Well, thank you very much. It was great talking to you.